Mhm. Hi, Dana. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I would just like to introduce you. You are the primary author of the ITDP Bike Share Planning Guide Edition 2018. The Institute for Transportation and Development uh, made this updated version of the guide a couple of years ago, and I'm hoping that you can give us a little bit of background on why this guide was developed in the first place and what the updates contain.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, we released the updated guide in 2018, but the original bike share planning guide came out back in 2014. Um, and as you may know, ITDP, we're a global organization, and we're made up of regional offices around the world where our local staff provides technical assistance to cities. And having the bike share planning guide as a resource really enabled our local staff to push for better designed and better implemented bike share systems at a time when bike share was kind of just coming onto the scene. So since 2014, the bike share planning guide has been used by a number of cities around the world to plan and implement their bike share systems. Um, and I guess aside from providing that design and planning guidance, I would say that a major motivation for the original guide that we also continued into the updated version was really to think about developing standardized metrics that enable cities to evaluate their bike share systems. And those didn't really exist before for bike share, before the original planning guide. And without those metrics, it was really difficult to not necessarily compare systems to each other,
Mhm.
but for cities to measure whether systems were improving over time, or to decide if systems were actually meeting the needs that were originally set out. Um, so having those metrics really, in our mind, helped to kind of create a race to the top. Um, at this time, like I mentioned, bike share was really just starting to emerge as sort of a key amenity that cities were starting to realize actually provided a lot of benefits aside from just sort of um, just functioning as sort of a tourist or recreation benefit. So we updated the guide. We started updating the guide in 2017 at another kind of key moment in the story of bike share, which is when dockless bike share really started to come onto the scene, and another of or several other changes to bike share were starting to come onto the scene as well. Um, so things like pedal assist e-bikes were starting to be introduced into bike share systems, and also things like pricing models were starting to change at that time, shifting from longer term, like monthly and annual memberships, towards things like per trip pricing, which made bike share a lot more accessible. Um, so ultimately, the guide still aims to help cities think about how bike share can help them meet these broader transportation goals, and then design systems that actually work towards those outcomes.
Right, and
And the
exactly, yeah. A guide is really meant to help these decision makers as they develop the programs. And we know that it's not a one size fits all. These have to still be tailored to a local context, to an individual
Mhm.
context. But are there some specific principles which guarantee a successful system despite the context that you've seen that are kind of applicable across global contexts?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of tailoring to local context is really critical, especially when we think about bike share. Um, I think one of the key things to keep in mind is making sure that whether it's politicians or other decision makers um, are really bought into the idea that bike share is public transportation, and that a well-designed bike share system provides a lot of value and benefits to the city. So having that understanding in place can really help to justify investments, whether that's financial or in terms of staff time from the city, help to justify those investments in bike share. So you asked about a couple of things that might sort of push a system to be more successful regardless of context. I think from our work, and I mentioned this before, there's really 3 key metrics that can help ensure that success. And I'll just talk about those really quickly. So the first is station density. And we recommend 10 to 16 stations per square kilometer. So that breaks down to about a station every 300 meters or so. And that really helps to ensure that there's a station within a convenient walking distance of where, population centers are. The next metric is what we call bike density, or bikes per resident. So that's, we recommend 10 to 30 bikes per 1,000 residents in the service area. So you not only want to have stations that are accessible within a reasonable walking distance, but you want to have enough bikes at those stations that people can reasonably assume that there's going to be a bike at the station when they need it. And then the last is the coverage area, and this one's really important. So we recommend a minimum of 10 square kilometers as a coverage area. And that helps to ensure that there's enough origins and destinations within the coverage area to ensure that system use is going to be relatively high. So I think with this metric, it's not just about the destinations. You also have to think about sort of the origins and how convenient it is for people to get to those stations to start their trip. And this really also speaks to, all 3 of these metrics together really help to sort of create a foundation of reliability. So even if you don't know exact station locations, you can be reasonably confident that there's going to be a station close to you at both your origin and your destination.
Yeah,
So those metrics.
yeah. This coverage area is something that I'm interested in because in the Philippines, where I'm doing a lot of work still, there's a modest budget for a bike share program, actually, as part of the COVID-19 emergency response fund, which is great because the national government, the local governments are really recognizing the importance of active mobility and these types of modes during the pandemic, of course in general, but especially now during the pandemic. And I'm wondering, because you mentioned that coverage area with a limited budget, and you're starting with really just a phase 1. How do you apply those principles, or those metrics that you mentioned? What do you really want to see from a phase 1 of a bike share system? Where would we hope that these kind of initial investments would be focused?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see that cities are kind of taking advantage of some of this interest in active mobility and thinking about investing in bike share as a result. I think even if you're not going to establish the full coverage area as part of a pilot or an inaugural phase of the system, you still want to think about those same ideas. So what types of trips are people taking, and what types of trips do you want them to take using bike share? So kind of thinking about the role and opportunity for bike share to either replace existing trips or create new trips. So is that, are you thinking about encouraging people to access public transit, so like a BRT or a metro? Are you trying to bring people to that system? So bike share serving sort of as a feeder, and what might that look like? Or are you thinking about encouraging just more people to cycle? So placing stations near existing cycle lanes, and perhaps more recreational places like waterfronts or open streets or other efforts, cycling or active mobility efforts that are put in place as part of a COVID-19 response, like temporary cycle lanes, for example. So I think it's really thinking about, especially in an inaugural phase, if you're not going to be able to establish the full coverage area, what types of trips are you trying to generate, and thinking about placing stations in a way that enables you to do that.
That's interesting. And I kind of have a follow-up question to that. In some of these scenarios, we might not have baseline data for the origin
Mm.
destination, either because it didn't exist before, we didn't have it,
Yep.
or those, types of trips may be changing, especially during the pandemic, where you might see more social mobility as opposed to the residential to downtown, commute. You might be seeing more trips to different types of places like hospitals, grocery stores, or others. How do we respond in real time and in deciding what those locations, the station locations, should be without that information right now?
Yeah, it can be challenging to think about that, especially with a station-based system, which kind of inherently feels a little bit inflexible. Once you sort of place those stations, um, depending on the model, they can be movable, but inevitably that's going to create additional logistical needs. Um, so I think that this is kind of a unique opportunity to implement a bike share system, given some of these shifts in travel patterns. And I think that it kind of, it might not be the inaugural phase. I think will inevitably create a situation where you need to make some decisions, test some things out, and then use that as sort of your baseline, to understand what those trips are looking like and which stations are seeing a lot of use and which aren't, and perhaps having the flexibility to relocate some of those lower use stations in as part of a subsequent phase. I think there's also an opportunity to think about the type of bike that's being used, that can help to address some of those flexibility challenges. So I'm thinking primarily about station-based systems in the US and Europe that are starting to integrate sort of the dockless hybrid. So bikes can either be left at the station, like a normal station-based system, or they can be locked outside of the station to a signpost or some other kind of street furniture. And so you're kind of getting sort of the best of both worlds in terms of the reliability of the stations, but also the flexibility of perhaps picking up a bike outside of a station.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I wanted to ask you a bit about, what are the common misconceptions or myths that you often hear about bike share? I know that it's been a number of years that we've seen so many good examples and so many successful models all over the world, but I'm sure that there are still some misconceptions about bike share.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big one is that bike share only really works or is sort of for um, young, wealthy men. Um, and while bike share ridership can reflect um, can reflect that demographic, I think what this really points to is an access issue, um, where you may not see people who look like you riding bike share, and that's really because it's harder for other demographics to access bike share, whether that's feeling not as physically fit to ride a bike in general, or whether that's being able to afford a bike share membership. So there are ways to address these access issues, whether that's through looking at integrating e-bikes, so that a wider variety of ages and abilities can access bike share, whether that's implementing reduced membership fees for lower income individuals. Um, so addressing and ensuring that there's a wide variety of bike share users can help to combat that misconception. Um, and then I think another interesting one is that only people who don't own a bike use bike share. Um, or if you already have a bike, you don't need bike share. Um, but that I think is a big misconception because we've seen across a lot of bike share systems that have been operating for a number of years, that many personal bike owners also use bike share because it's more flexible for one-way trips, or they're going to use it to connect it to a bus, and they don't want to have to bring their bike on the bus. There's a lot of trip types and use cases that benefit personal bike users to also use bike share.
Definitely. When we think about achieving a multimodal lifestyle, what we're really going after is having a menu of options, right? So I want to be able to take the bike where that is convenient, and then take a bus possibly for a longer trip. And then at the end of it, be able to take a train back if that's what needs to happen, and have that flexibility throughout. So yeah, I appreciate your comment about that. Um, are there any specific challenges that are very specific to mega cities of the global south? I know that ITDP is working in so many different cities across the globe. Especially the context that we work in Metro Manila, we tend to think that these are, they're very large cities, they're very dense. Planning systems are sometimes a bit lapsed, and we have a trouble sometimes getting caught up with a lot of the transportation planning. Are these normal challenges for any megacity or for all cities? And what kind of specific challenges are we seeing for these types of cities related to designing, implementing, and managing even bike share, especially that have not had much experience in managing bike share systems?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, thinking about megacities specifically. And we've seen bike share work in megacities. I'm thinking specifically of Mexico City, but even Rio de Janeiro has recently improved their bike share system and is seeing really high ridership. Even cities like Buenos Aires have really seen bike share take off over the past couple of years. So it can be done, but there are, I think, you're right in that there are some specific challenges to megacities. I think just the sheer size tends to be an issue in that, especially for station-based systems, the service area tends to align with higher income or kind of tourist-focused locations. And this is mainly because the financial model of kind of needing to get a return on investment on those initial stations, and then have the financial ability to expand into outer neighborhoods from there. And this is sort of where the question of for the city of what they want bike share to be and who they want it to serve. Just because that model has been used in the past doesn't necessarily mean it needs to, that's the only way to do it. But given the size of megacities, it can be challenging to site stations in outer neighborhoods because the financial investment just it's harder to make that work. But I think we can think about in megacities specifically, people may be taking longer trips just because it's destinations are maybe further from each other. So thinking about really investing and designing a bike share system around integration with public transit, could be a good opportunity. There are some cities that have really kind of thought about bike share a little bit differently in this context, implementing models like in Fortaleza in Brazil. They have a bike share system that's kind of an overnight model. So um, at bus stations, there's bike share there for sort of the last mile. So you take the bike back to your house and you actually keep it overnight, and then you can use it to ride back to the station in the morning. So that's kind of emphasizing that reliability piece, and also the connection to transit. So I think there could be interesting and like innovative models around integration that could work really well in megacities, that might be a little bit different than we've seen bike share, the role that bike share has played in smaller cities.
Yeah, and I think, the opportunity for megacities and bike share is really huge because it is more difficult to roll out huge infrastructure, huge transportation projects that cover every area,
Mm-hmm.
especially as a lot of these neighborhoods pop up and grow faster than we can really even plan for them. Certain areas may change completely by the time we get, more quote unquote, like formal, permanent transportation lines in there. And so I always thought that, with cities like Metro Manila, bike share is really important because you can actually roll out a lot of mobility options through bike share to large population for a lower investment in a way that really meets demand where it is on the ground in more real time. So, we're hoping that this first phase will really prove that concept and show the potential of it, for these types of cities specifically. Um, my last question, and thank you so much for your time, is really, of course, COVID-19 is top of mind. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, have you seen bike share systems need to adapt um, during this pandemic? Is it pretty much business as usual, or are there adjustments that have to be made, some pivots that you've seen really work at this time?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of variability in terms of um, adapting and responding to COVID-19 for bike share. I think we've seen, city-owned bike share compared to the newer private dockless offerings. City-owned bike share has fared a lot better, um, given that those systems are really closely are working closely with cities, and um, and operators are kind of clued into what cities' responses are looking like, and whether they need to shut down or can continue operating. Um, I think in the face of really low transit ridership, bike share has seen uh, expanded ridership across the board. Even looking at similar months from last year compared to this year, we're seeing an uptick in ridership. People feeling more comfortable using kind of a personal mode where they can safely distance. Um, and at first, I think there was a lot of focus with bike share operators on um, sanitation and making sure that bikes were being kind of wiped down. And there were a couple of, sprays and wipes that different operators were using for sanitation purposes. I think those are still in effect. Um, but I think as our understanding of the virus has improved, and there's sort of less fear um, around contracting the virus from surfaces. Um, there's been kind of a renewed demand for bike share. Um, and I think the opportunity there is that there is now a broader coalition of people who value active mobility, whether that's bike share or walking, or whether that's encourage them to buy their own bike. There's this larger coalition calling for better bike infrastructure, slower streets, and other efforts that are going to be really important to making sure that bike share and cycling is safe and reliable for everyone going forward. I think there's a lot of opportunity there in broadening that coalition that bike share will hopefully be able to capitalize on and really utilize to expand expand systems and expand access and just shift shift towards more active mobility and intermobility more broadly.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing all your insights with us today. The ITDP Bike Share Planning Guide 2018 is free to be downloaded online just by entering your information. So thank you so much to ITDP for making that a free resource that all of us can really benefit from.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, talk soon.